Well, close your ears if you don't want to hear a story of tyranny and oppression. If you want to hear a story of dragons and maidens or birds and the bees, then just shut off. And this is not a story in the depths of time. It's less than 100, well, 200 years. And it's not in a far-flung place. This all happened in West Wales. It was in the time of your great-great-great-grandparents. A time, sad to say, of very bad harvests. The rain had poured. The whole of the United Kingdom had bad weather, but you can imagine how bad it was in Pembrokeshire if it was considered bad in the rest of the country. Also, the Prime Minister at the time had brought in cheaper food from other countries, which was to feed the coal miners, not the farmers. And sadly, those farmers still had their costs. They still had to pay their rent, their taxes, and worst of all, they had these taxes to pay every time they moved anything along the road. Enter the villain, Thomas Bullin. He had just taken up his position as owner of the Turnpike Trust. And even though for years they'd had these taxes that had to be paid when people went along and traded on the main road, he brought in the sidebar, which was a tax that had to be paid even on the tiny little roads, only used by peasant farmers. And those peasant farmers had to bring lime to their land and take care of their soils. And there was no way they could do that now. Enter the hero, Thomas Rees. He was a giant of a man, head and shoulders above the others, strong and clever. He was actually known locally as Twm Carnabwth because he had built a stone house on the site of where he had built his own tŷ nos, which is a house that back in the day you could build a house if you were able to build it between sunrise and sunset. And you could actually have the land around that house that you could throw a stone to. Unfortunately, the only bit of land that people were given were bogland. And so his land was pretty poor. So he had to get a second job, which involved having to help do little jobs for his neighbours. And then he had a third job, which was deacon in the local chapel. And he was a very clever man and knew his Bible. So he'd learnt great tracts of the Bible, enough actually to be able to hold the Whitsun service, which is quite a thing to be able to do. And his fourth job was as a pugilist. Pugilist? What's that? Well, he was a prize fighter. He'd been so successful that he even took on Gabriel Davies from Carmarthen and lost an eye in that particular episode, but that's another story. And he was a bit of a drinker. Well, you might ask yourself, what's a man of the cloth? You know, a man who knows his Bible, what is he doing? Having fights and going down the pub. But, you know, back in those days, that's how people enjoyed themselves, you know, and through going down the pub, sharing a drink with people, telling stories, he got to know just how bad things were, not just where he lived, but throughout the country. The poor laws had just been brought out. The poor laws that criminalised being poor. You could be put in the workhouse. You couldn't just be poor. you were put in the workhouse. Times were rough, and there was a huge divide between the very rich and the very poor. I mean, it's difficult to believe now because we have so much equality, you know, so it's really difficult to understand those times. But life was tough, and they had to come up with a plan. They had to come up with some way to make their lives possible. So a plan was formed, and they all met down in the local barn in Glynsaethman, which was the local farm, and they all got together. And while they were discussing, Twm Carnabwth came up with an inspiration. Genesis 24, verse 60. This was all about Rebecca and how she had been told that thousands of her sisters would come upon the earth, and her seed, her legacy was that the gates of their enemies would be open to them. Oh, I mean, this was manna from heaven. This was God telling them directly that this was the way to go. This was the inspiration. And in order so that they wouldn't be recognized, they came up with the idea, let's dress in women's clothing, call ourselves Rebecca. We'll blacken our faces, we'll put straw under our bonnets, and we'll go out on the moonless night. And they would attack Weithdai, the nearest toll booth. And they pulled it stone from stone, right down to the ground. And the following week, another group of people who had heard of this happening, they did the same. And then they heard of somebody else who did it. And do you know, not one person was hurt. They were very careful that they were only going to pull down the buildings and not hurt anyone. And that spark that was lit in Weithdai, it seems, on the 13th of May, 1839, just spread through the land. And it was powerful enough to get the government of the day to bring in the Turnpike South Wales Act in 1844. And you know, old Thomas Rees went on for another 36 years, quietly, living a life, doing a little bit of boxing, but you know, he was getting old, and still carrying on with a local chapel, helping his neighbours in any way he could. And on his gravestone is written, "No one but God knows what may happen one day. While fetching a cabbage for my dinner, death came into my garden and struck me down," which is the best way to go, I think.